On March 18, 1997, a black hearse turned onto St. James Place in Brooklyn, and the street went quiet. Thousands of people pressed against police barricades, on fire escapes, on rooftops, leaning out of windows in buildings where the paint was peeling and the radiators clanked in winter. There were older women in church hats, kids in puffy jackets skipping school, and grown men crying. And then, in the middle of it, somebody put on his music. Hypnotize came pouring out of a speaker propped in a window, and the funeral, a slow, solemn procession with flowers spelling out B.I.G in white carnations, became something else entirely. People started dancing on the sidewalk and on top of parked cars. But it went further than that. Police moved in, 10 people were arrested, and the cameras caught a neighborhood grieving the only way it knew how, loudly. The hearse rolled past a brownstone at 226 St. James Place, where his mother had raised him, on the 3rd floor. That was the window he used to look out of. He was coming home, for the last time, and the block he made famous was overcome. Most tellings of this story start at the beginning, a birth, a childhood, a struggle, a rise. This one takes a different path, because the story of Christopher Wallace, the Notorious B.I.G, is not really a straight line from Brooklyn to the grave. It is a story about a 9-block radius and about a cassette tape recorded in a basement that changed the direction of American music. But it is also more than that. It is a story about a friendship that curdled into the most dangerous feud in hip-hop history, and about a man who predicted his own death on his first album, and spent his last years quietly trying to outrun the ending he had already written. He was 24 years old when the shots came through the passenger door. He left behind 2 albums, the entire catalogue, and yet, almost 30 years later, he remains at the center of the argument over the greatest rapper who ever lived. Many would say, he ends it. How a heavy-set kid with a lazy eye, who sold crack 100 feet from his mother's front door, became the voice of a city, and why it ended at a red light in Los Angeles, 3,000 miles from home, in a case that has never been solved, begins with the corner. Fulton Street and St. James Place, in Clinton Hill, Brooklyn, though everyone who lived there would say with a certain pride that it was really Bed-Stuy, Bedford-Stuyvesant. In the mid-1980s, this was not the Brooklyn of coffee shops and million-dollar brownstones. The city had pulled its money out, and buildings sat hollowed and burned. And into that vacuum came something small enough to fit in a palm, and powerful enough to consume a neighborhood. Crack cocaine. By 1986, it was everywhere. On Fulton Street, dealers worked in shifts, like it was a factory job. In a way, the only factory left. But the change went beyond the trade itself. The sound of the block changed to radios, sirens, the crackle of walkie-talkies, and the particular silence that fell when an unfamiliar car slowed down. On the 3rd floor of 226 St. James Place, a woman named Voletta Wallace was doing everything in her power to keep that world on the other side of her door. She had come to New York from Trelawney, Jamaica as a teenager and trained as a preschool teacher. She worked days in a classroom, took night courses, and picked up extra work because there was rent to pay and a son to feed. The reason she carried it alone was simple. The boy's father, a man named Selwyn George Latore, had walked out when the child was 2 years old and essentially never looked back. So it was the two of them, Voletta and Christopher. Christopher, George Latore. Wallace was born May 21, 1972, at St. Mary's Hospital in Brooklyn, a big baby who became a big kid, who became, eventually, a very big man. In the beginning, though, He was simply her whole world, and she was his. One detail tends to get lost because it does not fit the mythology. He was a good student. At Queen of All Saints, the Catholic middle school his mother sacrificed to afford, Christopher Wallace won multiple awards for English. Teachers noticed the vocabulary, the memory, the way words seemed to arrange themselves for him without effort, and his mother reinforced it at every turn. She filled the apartment with books, monitored his homework, and sent him to Jamaica in the summers to stay with family, keeping him away from the block when school was out. She built a wall around him, out of Catholic school tuition, curfews, and church on Sundays. And for a while, the wall held. But walls in Bed-Stuy in the 1980s were up against something patient. The corner was 100 feet away, visible from the window. The money, the sneakers, the older guys with gold ropes around their necks who never seemed to run out of anything. And there was a cruel arithmetic at work. The very thing that kept a roof over his head, Valletta's 2 jobs and long hours, meant the door was unguarded for stretches of every single day. He was about 12 when he started hustling on Fulton Street, and his mother had no idea, genuinely. Years later, she told a story that would be funny, if it were not so painful. She found a plate in his room with something dried and white caked on it, and threw it out, annoyed, thinking her son had left old mashed potatoes sitting around. It was crack, drying on a plate, in her home. She had raised an honor student and a drug dealer, and for years they lived in the same body, and she only knew about one of them. That double life is more than a detail. It is the origin of the artistic voice. Christopher Wallace learned, before he was old enough to shave, how to be 2 people at once, the obedient son at the dinner table and the businessman on the corner. He learned to compartmentalize, to observe, to hold contradictions without flinching. Later, the world would marvel at how the Notorious B.I.G. could be hilarious and terrifying in the same verse, charming and menacing, celebratory, and suicidal. He had been rehearsing that since he was 12. The neighborhood kids called him Big. No cleverness to it. He was simply the largest kid in the room, 6 feet tall before high school was done, heading toward 300 pounds. He also had a condition called strabismus, a lazy eye, that made him self-conscious his whole life. Big, dark-skinned, cross-eyed. He would later put it in a song, flatly, that he had been called black and ugly as ever. Some people bury a wound like that. He turned his into a weapon. He made the joke first, made it better than anyone else could, and then, remarkably, made you believe him when he called himself a player by force of language alone. The name he chose came from a movie. Let's Do It Again, from 1975, with Sidney Poitier and Bill Cosby, which featured a smooth, dangerous gangster played by Calvin Lockhart, named Biggie Smalls. Christopher took it, and it fit like it had been written for him. Biggie Smalls of Fulton Street. High school is where the 2 lives stopped balancing. He had started at Bishop Laughlin Memorial High School, another Catholic school on his mother's paycheck, but transferred to George Westinghouse Career and Technical Education High School in downtown Brooklyn, a public school. And here, the story gets stranger. The hallways of Westinghouse at that moment held an almost impossible concentration of future legends. A skinny kid from the Marcy projects named Sean Carter, and a hyperactive Long Island transplant named Trevor Smith. Jay-Z and Busta Rhymes. Nobody knew, of course. They were kids cutting class, battling in the lunchroom, trading rhymes in stairwells where the acoustics made a voice sound bigger than it was. Busta would later recall battling big in those years, and being stunned. The big kid was effortless, the words falling out fully formed in that low, unhurried voice. But the classroom could not compete anymore. The corner was winning. His grades collapsed, the money in his pocket got heavier, and at 17, over his mother's protests, over everything she had built, Christopher Wallace dropped out of school. He would say later that he went full-time. Full-time meant Fulton Street, standing outside in January when the wind came off the East River, serving people whose faces were collapsing month by month. He saw what the product did, and he sold it anyway. He was never sentimental about it, then or ever. Part of what made his music land so hard was his refusal to pretend the choice had been anything other than what it was. The consequences arrived on schedule. In 1989, he was arrested in Brooklyn on a weapons charge, a 9mm, and received 5 years probation. In 1990, he was arrested again for violating that probation. Then, it got worse. In 1991, he took the operation on the road, dealing crack in North Carolina, where the prices were better, and, it turned out, so were the police. They caught him, and Christopher Wallace, 19 years old, sat in a North Carolina jail cell for 9 months, waiting on bail money. 9 months meant no music, no Fulton Street, no mother's cooking. Just time. The one thing the corner never gives, suddenly available in crushing supply. Whatever a 19-year-old thinks about for 9 months in a cell, some of it stayed with him. Because the man who came home was still a hustler. But something in him had started reaching for the exit. The exit turned out to be a basement. Around the corner from Fulton Street lived a DJ who went by the name 50 Grand. He had turntables, a mixer, and a tape deck. A bedroom basement setup, nothing fancy. Cables running everywhere with that smell Brooklyn basements have of concrete, dust, and somebody's laundry. Local MCs would come through and rhyme over instrumentals. And Big started coming through too. At first, just for fun, to pass time between shifts. Freestyling was a neighborhood sport, and he was quietly becoming the neighborhood champion. Grainy camcorder footage from this era still circulates. A teenage Biggie on Bedford Avenue, crowd pressed around him, hoodie and sunglasses, dismantling another kid in a street battle while the block roars. And even through the static, one thing is visible. The crowd already knows. He is not competing. He is performing. At some point in 1991, they pressed record. The demo tape made in 50 Grand's basement was rough, the levels uneven, the beats borrowed, and Big rapped on it under the name Biggie Smalls. By his own account, he did not take it seriously. Music was a hobby, and hobbies did not pay for Timberlands. The tape was simply something that existed, passed around the neighborhood the way tapes were. But tapes travel. This one traveled into the hands of Mr. C, the DJ for Big Daddy Kane, and one of the most respected figures in New York hip-hop. C heard the tape and had the reaction that would soon become an industry-wide phenomenon. He needed to know who this was. And it went further. C got the tape to the Source magazine, at the time the definitive publication of hip-hop journalism, and to an editor named Matty C, who ran a monthly column called Unsigned Hype, a spotlight on undiscovered talent. It had already flagged future stars, and in the March 1992 issue, the column featured a 20-year-old from Bed-Stuy, named Biggie Smalls. One column, a few paragraphs, and a photo. From there, the tape moved through actual industry hands and landed on the desk of a young A&R executive at Uptown Records. 22 years old, from Harlem, ferociously ambitious, already responsible for shaping Mary J. Blige's sound and Jodeci's image, and already irritating half the executives above him with the sheer velocity of his self-belief. Sean Combs. Puffy. Puffy pressed play, and what he heard did not compute. The voice was enormous, grimy, street, undeniably hard, but the delivery was pocketed and smooth, almost lazy in its confidence, every syllable landing exactly where it wanted to. It was street corner content, with jazz musician timing. Puffy would describe it later in almost mystical terms. He thought this was the best rapper he had ever heard. Not one of the best. The best. He set up a meeting. The scene is worth describing. Christopher Wallace, 300 pounds of Fulton Street, walking into the Manhattan offices of Uptown Records to meet a fast-talking Harlem executive in expensive shoes. Two men, 1 year apart in age, from different tribes of the same city. The hustler and the salesman, neither entirely sure the other was for real. On paper, it should not have worked. It became one of the most consequential partnerships in the history of American music. Uptown signed him. There was one wrinkle. A Chicago rapper already had claim to the name Biggie Smalls, so Christopher needed something new for the paperwork. He reached back to the language of outlaws and came out with something that sounded less like a rap name and more like a title. The Notorious B.I.G. Before the fame, which came fast and came strange, there is a stretch of this story that almost nobody dwells on, and it may be the most important stretch of all. The deal nearly collapsed at the start. In 1993, Uptown Records fired Sean Combs. Too ambitious, too loud, too much, depending on the telling. And when Puffy went, Biggie's future at the label went grey. Here was a man who had glimpsed the exit, an actual record deal and an actual advance, watching the door begin to swing shut. So he did what the corner had trained him to do. He went back to work. This is documented, and it says a great deal. With his record deal in limbo, Christopher Wallace went back to selling drugs, traveling south again to hustle, because promises do not pay rent. And there was more at stake now. In August of 1993, his girlfriend Jan gave birth to his daughter, Tiana. Fatherhood, for a man whose own father had disappeared, was not an abstraction. It was a debt he intended to pay. When Puffy found out Big was back in the streets, he reportedly hit the roof, called him and demanded he stop, told him to trust the plan, that this was real, that the label was coming. And the label came. Puffy took his severance and his Rolodex and founded Bad Boy Entertainment, striking a distribution deal with Arista Records. And he brought Biggie with him as the cornerstone, not an artist on the roster, the foundation of the entire building. The first proper release was a song called Party and Bullshit, which appeared in 1993 on the soundtrack to the film Who's the Man, and it captures a star arriving in real time. The record knocks. But what separated him immediately ran deeper. The details, the specificity, a novelist's eye, dropped into party music. New York noticed. Remixes started arriving, Biggie stealing the show on Mary J. Blige records, trading bars alongside established names, a new voice pushing into the conversation, 16 bars at a time. The city started saying his name, and in a Manhattan studio, he began building the record that would say it permanently. Ready to Die arrived on September 13th, 1994, and the shorthand, classic debut, East Coast Landmark, undersells it badly. It is an autobiography, with a body count. It opens, literally, with a birth. The intro track dramatizes Christopher Wallace's life in audio vignettes, From the delivery room, through the stick-ups, through the prison gate, before the first song even starts. And it goes further at the other end. The album closes, more than 20 tracks later, with a song called Suicidal Thoughts, in which the narrator calls a friend in the middle of the night, talks himself to the edge, and pulls the trigger. The record ends with a gunshot and a dial tone. A debut from a 22-year-old that begins with his birth and ends with his death. Hip-hop in 1994 was full of violence, but it was almost always violence pointed outward. Biggie pointed it inward. He rapped about the paranoia, the self-loathing, the exhaustion under the bravado. Everyday Struggle, a hit record, opens with the flat announcement that he does not want to live anymore. And he delivered all of it in that voice, thick and unbothered, like the news being read by a man who had already survived the news. The recording happened in two distinct phases, and the seam is audible. The early sessions produced the darkest material, raw, cold, with almost no concessions to radio. Then the direction shifted. Puffy came back around with his vision fully formed and pushed for records for the clubs and the summer. Big resisted. He thought some of it was soft, and Puffy insisted. Out of that argument came Juicy. Over a warm Mum sample, Biggie tells his entire life story. The magazines on the wall, the mother missing meals, the landlord and the bad Thanksgivings, the teachers who said he would never amount to anything. And he tells it from the other side, from the top of the mountain, without bitterness. It is a victory lap that makes the whole neighborhood feel like it won. And its opening line, "It was all a dream," may be the most famous first line in the history of the genre. Juicy hit. Then it got bigger. Big Popper, a smooth, winking record, put this enormous man in a Coogie sweater on every television in America and made him impossible not to find charming. That was his secret weapon all along. The menace earned respect, but the charm earned love. Then the One More Chance remix arrived in 1995 and debuted at number 5 on the Hot 100, at the time tying the record for the highest debut ever, a record it shared with Michael Jackson. A crack dealer from Fulton Street was sharing chart records with Michael Jackson. The album went platinum and kept going, eventually selling millions upon millions, and The Source gave it 4.5 mics. But something larger was happening in New York. The city's hip-hop crown had been drifting west for years. Dre and Snoop had made Los Angeles the center of the rap universe, and the genre's birthplace had been reduced to invoking the old days. Biggie ended that conversation, more or less single-handedly. At the Source Awards in August 1995, he took home Best New Artist and Best Live Performer, and Ready to Die won album honors. New York had its king. And the city called him exactly that, the King of New York, after the movie. Frank White. He wore the title the way he wore everything, as if it had been tailored. His personal life was moving at the same reckless speed. At a Bad Boy photo shoot in the summer of 1994, he met a singer from Newark, the label's first lady, a gifted vocalist and writer named Faith Evans. And then it moved even faster. Barely more than a week after they met, days, not months, Christopher Wallace and Faith Evans were married. On August 4th, 1994. He had not yet released his album. She barely knew his friends. It was impulsive, romantic, doomed, and completely sincere, all at once, which describes a fair number of his decisions. By the end of 1994, the picture looked like this. He was 22, with a wife, a baby daughter, a platinum-bound album, the best-dressed entourage in Brooklyn, and a title. And he was pulling others up behind him. Junior M.A.F.I.A, the friends he grew up with, whom he wrote for, executive produced, and built into an act. Their record player's anthem was about to make stars of them, and one of them, a small, ferocious woman from his own neighborhood named Kimberly Jones. Lil Kim was about to become a legend in her own right under his mentorship. Getting everyone out was the plan, and he was executing it. The mother he would move out of the old apartment, the daughter with the college fund, the crew with the record deals. For about 10 weeks, the story was perfect. Then came the night of November 30th, 1994. A lobby in Times Square, gunfire in a recording studio building, and the story bent toward its ending. To understand that night, the account has to back up. Because before there was a war, there was a friendship, a real one. And the fact that it was real is what made everything afterward so poisonous. Tupac Shakur and Christopher Wallace met in 1993 before Ready to Die, when Big was still a rumor with a demo. Tupac was already famous, a movie star, a platinum artist, hip-hop's live wire. And by every account from that period, he took the big kid from Brooklyn under his wing with genuine warmth. Big would visit him in California, and Tupac would host him like family, cooking for the whole crew, handing out advice, treating him like a little brother, despite Biggie's size making that visual comical. They performed together. Footage survives of the two on-stage trading verses, Pac grinning at Big's punchlines like a proud sibling. Biggie, by his own admission, studied him, how Pac worked a crowd, how he moved through fame. And it went further than admiration. At one point, before Bad Boy fully took off, Biggie asked Tupac to become his manager. Pac declined, and told him to stay with Puffy, that Puffy would make him a star. That is who they were to each other, which is what makes November 30th, 1994, one of the genuine tragedies inside this larger one. That night, Tupac arrived at Quad Studios on Times Square to record a guest verse. Biggie and Puffy happened to be in the same building, upstairs, working. In the lobby, Tupac was ambushed by 3 men in a robbery, around $40,000 in jewelry taken. He was pistol-whipped and shot 5 times, and survived. He walked out of the hospital against medical advice the next day and appeared in court in a wheelchair, bandaged, to hear a jury convict him in his sexual abuse case. Lying in that lobby, bleeding, Pac looked up and, in his telling, saw people from Biggie's world nearby and read something in their faces. From that wound, in that moment, a conviction took root in him that would never fully leave. That he had been set up, that Biggie and Puffy knew that his friend had let him walk into an ambush. Biggie denied it, then, always, to interviewers, to friends, and according to those close to him, in private, where there was nothing to gain. No credible evidence has ever tied him to the shooting. But Tupac did not need a courtroom. He entered prison in early 1995 to serve his sentence, and prison is a furnace for a grievance. The suspicion hardened into certainty, and the certainty into rage. Then Bad Boy released a Biggie B-side, called Who Shot Ya? Big and Puffy insisted the record had been made before the Quad shooting, that it was not about Pac at all, and that may be true. But timing writes its own story. A song with that title, in that voice, carrying that much menace, arriving months after a former friend was shot 5 times in the same building, was heard by Tupac exactly as expected, as a taunt, as a confession set to a beat. The fuse was lit, It needed only money and muscle to become a bomb. It got both. In October 1995, when Suge Knight, the CEO of Death Row Records, the most feared man in the music business, a former bodyguard with a violent reputation, posted $1.4 million to bail Tupac out of prison. The price was Pac's signature on a death row contract. Tupac walked out of Clinton Correctional and onto a private plane to Los Angeles, owned, energized, and aimed at Bad Boy Records. Suge had already declared his intentions publicly in one of the most infamous moments in music history. At that same August 1995 Source Awards, the night of Biggie's coronation, in a New York theater, Suge took the podium and, with Puffy sitting in the audience, invited any artist tired of an executive producer dancing in all the videos to come to death row. Everyone understood who he meant, and the room turned openly hostile. Later that night, Snoop Dogg stood on stage and challenged the crowd directly, asking whether the East Coast really had no love for Dre and Snoop. The booing answered him. A magazine cover soon framed it as a war between the coasts, and the media amplified it from every direction. What had begun as one wounded man's suspicion about one terrible night in a lobby was now an industry-wide Cold War, with armies, flags, and a soundtrack. And Christopher Wallace stood at the center of it, insisting to anyone who would listen that he had never wanted any of this. 1996 is the year the walls closed in, not all at once, but in increments. In June, Tupac released Hit 'Em Up. There has never been a diss record like it, before or since, because Hit 'Em Up is not really a song, it is a threat with a chorus. Pac goes straight for everything sacred. He claims Biggie's wife, by name, in the first breath of the record, and mocks Big's crew, his weight, his authenticity. And then it goes further. He drops the pretense of art entirely and issues what sound like direct promises of violence. To Biggie, to Puffy, to Junior M.A.F.I.A, to anyone standing near them. The record detonated across the country, and attention turned to Brooklyn for the response. It never really came. That is the part of the story people tend to forget. Biggie, the greatest battle rapper of his generation, a man who had ended careers in lunchrooms for free, essentially declined the war. There was no answer record. In interviews, he stayed measured, almost weary, repeating that he had nothing to do with Pac's shooting, that the beef was built on a misunderstanding, that he still did not fully grasp how a friendship had turned into this. Whether it was wisdom, fear, or grief for the friendship itself, likely some braid of all three, Faith Evans would later describe a man genuinely bewildered by the hate, who would hear Pac's insults and shake his head, as if listening to a brother breaking down from 3,000 miles away. The marriage, meanwhile, was coming apart under its own weight. The speed of it, the fame, the infidelities, the chaos. He and Faith separated, though they never fully let go of each other, drifting apart and back, the way people do when the love is real, but the life around it is burning. His body began paying costs as well. In September 1996, a car accident shattered his left leg. Not a sprain, a shattering. He spent weeks recovering, underwent surgery, and the man who had commanded stages now moved with a cane. 24 years old, walking like someone twice his age. Photographs from the period show it plainly. The weight heavier, the eyes tired, the cane in hand. The armor of invincibility that superstardom issues had cracked. Then, on September 7th, 1996, in Las Vegas, Tupac Shakur, riding in a black BMW, driven by Suge Knight after a Mike Tyson fight, was caught at a red light near the Strip when a white Cadillac pulled alongside and opened fire. 4 bullets hit him. He fought in a hospital bed for 6 days. And on September 13th, Tupac died. He was 25. By every close account, Big felt no triumph that week. None. Those around him describe shock and something heavier underneath it, grief, tangled with dread. Grief because underneath 2 years of poison. That had been his friend. The man who cooked for him, who told him to stick with Puffy, who grinned at his punchlines on stage. And it went deeper than grief. Dread. Because if it could happen to Pac, with Death Row's whole army around him, sitting next to Suge Knight himself, then the unthinkable was thinkable for anyone. An excruciating irony shadows everything from this point forward. The moment Tupac died, rumor and suspicion swung toward Bad Boy. No charges ever came, and no credible evidence ever tied Biggie or Puffy to Las Vegas. Biggie's camp maintained he was in New York and New Jersey at the time. But the whisper economy does not require evidence. In certain rooms in Los Angeles, a story was calcifying. And stories like that rarely stay stories. Against all of it, the leg, the beef, the death, the marriage, Christopher Wallace was making an album, and not a cautious one. Life After Death was a double album, 24 tracks, and even the title was an answer to his own debut. He had introduced himself to the world as ready to die. And now, having watched death circle everyone around him, he was declaring something close to defiance. That there was existence on the other side of all this, and that he intended to be around for it. The sessions, spread across 1996 into early 1997, produced the most complete portrait of his abilities ever committed to tape. This is the album where he stops being a great rapper and becomes a shapeshifter. A full-song Bone Thug-style double time on Notorious Thugs that outruns the inventors of the style. An entire heist film with dialogue and plot twists closer to a screenplay than a song. And the range widens from there. He makes mafioso opulence sound effortless, makes radio records sound easy, duets with R. Kelly, spars with Jay-Z, his old Westinghouse hallway mate, by then a rising star himself, and floats over Hypnotize with the relaxed authority of a man who knows the crown fits. On October 29, 1996, in the middle of all this, Faith gave birth to their son, Christopher Wallace Jr., CJ, a boy who would grow up with his father's name, his father's face, and no memories of the man at all. People who spent time with Big in these final months describe consistently the same thing. A man in transition. He talked about the beef with open exhaustion, and he talked about God more. And there was more to it than talk. He had survived the streets and the industry's ugliest chapter, buried a friend turned enemy, become a father twice over, and, at 24, wealthy. He was openly planning acts 2 and 3, a label of his own, films. He had cut back on drinking, and friends noticed him talking about the future in specifics, which, for a man whose first album ended in a suicide note, was its own kind of miracle. That is what makes the next decision the one people have replayed for almost 30 years. In February 1997, with Life After Death finished and weeks from release, Biggie went to Los Angeles. Not for a quick trip, but for an extended stay. Doing press, shooting the lavish Hypnotize video, making the rounds. The choice was deliberate, almost pointed. Members of his circle were uneasy, and some told him plainly not to go. That L.A., after Pac's death, was dangerous for anyone associated with Bad Boy. He went anyway, and he explained why in interviews that are difficult to watch now. He wanted to show his face, to demonstrate there was no war, that a Brooklyn man could stand in California without armies, that the coast versus coast narrative was a media invention. He refused to keep feeding. Peace, in his mind, was not a press release. It was presence. The reasoning is admirable. People who loved him have spent decades wishing he had been more afraid. On March 7, 1997, at the Soul Train Music Awards, Biggie walked on stage with his cane to present an award, and from pockets of the Los Angeles crowd came booing. He handled it with a raised eyebrow and a shrug, smooth as ever, on the surface. But the message in the room was audible to everyone. Some of this city had not made peace. He had one more night in Los Angeles. March 8, 1997, was a Saturday night. The Peterson Automotive Museum sits at the corner of Wilshire Boulevard and Fairfax Avenue, a gleaming building full of vintage cars. And on this night, host to one of the most star-packed parties of awards weekend, thrown by Vibe magazine and Quest Records. Athletes, actors, executives, half the music industry. The dance floor was shoulder to shoulder. Biggie was having a good night. That detail survives in every account. Because of the leg, he posted up rather than danced, holding court at a table, laughing, watching the room move to his own records. And the timing sharpened everything. Hypnotize had just come out as a single and was everywhere, on its way to #1, and Life After Death was 17 days from release. The hardest years appeared to be behind him. In photographs from that night, he looks relaxed. He looks happy. Sometime after midnight, the fire marshals shut the party down for overcrowding, and the crowd, hundreds of people, spilled out onto Wilshire all at once, a slow chaos of valets, headlights, and famous people looking for their cars. Around 12:30 in the morning, now March 9th, the Bad Boy convoy loaded up, 2 GMC Suburbans and a trail vehicle. Puffy rode in the lead truck, and Biggie climbed into the front passenger seat of the second, a dark green Suburban, with his close friend Damian D-Rock Butler. Junior M.A.F.I.A.'s Lil Cease, and their driver inside. They pulled onto Fairfax, heading the short distance back toward the hotel, and the trucks became slightly separated in traffic, 50 yards, maybe less. Biggie's Suburban stopped at a red light at Wilshire and Fairfax, directly across from the museum they had just left. The street was still thick with partygoers. People were calling out to him through the window, and the truck's own stereo was reportedly playing his new album. Then a dark Chevrolet Impala SS pulled up along the passenger side. The driver, a black man in a suit and bow tie by witness accounts, raised a pistol and fired directly into the passenger door. 6 or 7 rounds. The Impala turned into the side streets and disappeared. And it has stayed gone, as of the making of this video, for 29 years. 4 bullets hit Christopher Wallace. His people were on him in seconds, and Puffy ran back from the lead truck. They did not wait for an ambulance. They pushed the Suburban through the lights to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, minutes away, where doctors worked on him, desperately. At 1:15 a.m., on March 9th, 1997, Christopher Wallace was pronounced dead. He was 24 years old. His son was 4 months old. His album was 17 days from release. And an autopsy report, kept sealed for 15 years, would eventually reveal how narrow the margin was. Of the 4 shots, 3 struck areas he might have survived. Only one, the final wound, tearing through his hip and up through his vital organs, was fatal. One bullet, one red light, 100 feet from a museum full of witnesses, and nobody has ever been convicted. It may be the single most damning fact in the history of American celebrity. The two biggest rap stars on the planet were murdered 6 months apart in drive-by shootings, at red lights, in front of crowds. And for decades, both cases sat officially unsolved. In Tupac's case, an arrest finally came in 2023, nearly 3 decades later. In Biggie's case, nothing. No arrest, no trial, no answer. The theories, however, became an industry of their own. The investigation deteriorated almost immediately. Witnesses in the crowd of hundreds gave fragmentary, conflicting accounts, and then, in many cases, stopped talking altogether. And it got stranger. As LAPD detectives dug, the case grew tendrils into the most explosive police scandal in the city's history, the Rampart corruption affair, because a handful of LA officers turned out to have been moonlighting in the orbit of death row records. One detective's theory pointed at a corrupt officer named David Mack and an associate who resembled witness sketches. Others pointed to gang retaliation stemming from the Vegas shooting. Others still to Suge Knight's circle, settling scores. Violetta Wallace, Biggie's mother, the preschool teacher from the 3rd floor, spent years suing the city of Los Angeles, accusing the department of covering up police involvement. A 2005 trial ended in a mistrial after evidence surfaced that the LAPD had withheld documents, and the judge sanctioned the city more than $1 million. The suit was eventually dismissed without prejudice in 2010, and the case files went back into their boxes. Task forces have opened and closed. Documentaries have named names. And still, legally speaking, the murder of Christopher Wallace belongs to no one. In March of 1997, though, the world did not yet have decades of theories. It had the absence where he used to be. And, 16 days after his death, it had the album. Life After Death arrived on March 25, 1997, exactly as scheduled, with cover art that had suddenly become difficult to look at. Biggie, in black, standing calmly beside a hearse. It debuted at number 1. And what happened next went beyond morning-driven sales. The album was simply that good, and it kept selling for years, eventually being certified diamond, more than 10 million copies. A commercial landmark almost no rap album had ever reached. Hypnotize went to number 1 on the Hot 100, and that summer, Mo Money Mo Problems went to number 1 as well, making the Notorious B.I.G. the first artist in the history of the chart to land 2 posthumous number 1 singles. And that second record carries its own weight on close listening. It is joyful, one of the most purely fun records Bad Boy ever made. And threaded through it is Biggie at the peak of his powers, essentially auditing the cost of everything he had won. Then came March 18th, the day this account began. The private service was held in Manhattan at the Frankie Campbell Funeral Chapel, the same discreet institution that has buried old money New York for a century. Faith Evans sang, Puffy spoke, and his mother sat in the front row and endured what no parent should. Then the procession crossed the river, and Brooklyn took over. The hearse rolled slowly through Bed-Stuy and Clinton Hill, down the streets he had named in songs, past the corner where 12-year-old Christopher had made his worst decision, and 20-year-old Biggie had recorded his way out of it. The crowds were enormous. And when Hypnotize came out of that window and people climbed onto cars and danced, when the police waded in and the news cameras rolled, something was being said. that no eulogy inside a Manhattan chapel could say. He was theirs, not the industry's, and not the media's, which had spent 2 years selling a coastal war with his face on it. He was a kid from the 3rd floor of 226 St. James Place, who had described their exact lives, the same struggle, the same stoops, the same Thanksgivings, with more precision, wit, and honesty than anyone ever had, and who had made the whole world listen. The temptation is to file this story under tragedy and move on. Another gifted young man consumed by the very world that made him. That is true as far as it goes. But it flattens him, and he was the least flat person imaginable. Consider instead what he accomplished in the time he had. 2 albums, roughly 4 years in the public eye. In that span, he re-centered the entire genre back to New York, perfected a storytelling technique that every rapper since has studied, mentored Lil' Kim and an entire crew into careers, helped build Bad Boy into an empire, and left behind a body of work so dense that artists are still finding new things inside verses recorded before some of them were born. And the influence reached further still. Jay-Z, the kid from the other Westinghouse hallway, carried pieces of Big's style and Big's fallen crown into his own dynasty, and has spent 30 years telling anyone who asks who the greatest was. The murals came and never stopped coming. His face, 20 feet tall, watching over Bedford-Stuyvesant from brick walls. And in 2019, the recognition became official. The city of New York renamed his corner, and the intersection near St. James Place and Fulton Street now carries a street sign reading, Christopher Wallace Way. It is the same pavement. The corner that nearly consumed him now permanently bears his name. His children grew up. Tiana opened a clothing store in Brooklyn, honoring her father, and CJ became an actor, his father's face, looking out of a grown man's eyes. And Valletta Wallace, the woman from Trelawney who once threw out a plate of what she thought was mashed potatoes, spent nearly 3 decades as the fierce, dignified keeper of her son's legacy, running his estate, funding scholarships through his foundation, pressing for answers the city of Los Angeles never gave her. She died in early 2025, having outlived her only child by 28 years. She once said that she never knew the Notorious B.I.G. She only knew Christopher. That may be the truest frame for the whole story. The world got the M.A.F.I.A, the King of New York, Frank White, the greatest of all time. She got the boy who won English awards and lied about the plate. Both of them died at that red light. It was all a dream. That is how he opened his career, reading his own life back, like a story. He used to tell interviewers with a low laugh that he never thought any of it was possible for someone like him, heavy-set, black, cross-eyed, from Fulton Street. And then he made it possible, made it look easy, and was gone before he could see what he had built. 29 years later, a car pulls up to a light at Wilshire and Fairfax, and a driver, without thinking, turns the volume up, because that voice has come on the radio. Unhurried, enormous, alive. And somewhere in Brooklyn, on a renamed corner, the sign catches the light. Sicker than your average. Rest in peace, Christopher Wallace.